Have you ever noticed this disturbing pattern? The more you try to explain yourself to a toxic person, the more they twist your words, push your buttons, and drain your peace. You walk away feeling confused, maybe even ashamed, while they walk away feeling powerful. Why? Because the moment you start defending yourself, you've already lost control of the conversation. You're no longer speaking for clarity, you're speaking for survival. But here's the truth Stoic philosophy wants you to remember. You owe no one an explanation for protecting your peace, especially not those who feed off your reactions like parasites feeding on your light. In this video, we'll break down one of the most effective Stoic techniques to disarm manipulators. Not through arguments, but through the radical power of silence. You'll learn how to walk away without guilt, respond without words, and take back the energy that was never theirs to claim. So if you're ready to stop being emotionally available to people who don't deserve you, watch closely. Like this video if it speaks to something deep in you, and subscribe for more grounded, no-nonsense Stoic wisdom every week. Your clarity begins now.
Number 1.
Don't yell, don't explain. There's a strange trap we fall into with toxic people. It doesn't begin with shouting or insults. It begins with a quiet, desperate hope. The hope that if we just explain ourselves one more time, they'll finally understand. That if we just raise our voice a little louder, they'll finally hear the truth. But as the Stoics would remind us, hope, when placed in the wrong hands, is not a virtue, it's a liability, especially when that hope is used to justify staying in a dynamic where your clarity is constantly distorted and your dignity slowly eroded. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." In other words, do not stoop, do not mirror their chaos, do not lose your calm in an effort to convince someone who has no intention of being convinced. Because what toxic people crave most isn't truth. It's attention. It's the thrill of making you question yourself. They study you not to understand, but to exploit. And here's where most people misunderstand strength. We often think strength looks like standing your ground and making your case loud and clear. But to the Stoic, strength is restraint. It's knowing when to speak and knowing when silence speaks louder. When you explain yourself to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, you enter a courtroom where the verdict has already been decided. No matter how honest, articulate, or emotional you are, they will twist your words, weaponize your vulnerability, and make you feel small for even trying. This is not a debate, it's a performance. One where your role is already written. You are cast as the overreactor, the one who always takes things personally, the one who just needs to calm down. And the more you speak, the more power you give to the script they wrote for you. So the only way to win is not to play. Seneca offers us a critical reminder in his letters. As long as you live, keep learning how to live. Part of that learning involves recognizing when an apology or an explanation is not a bridge to connection, but a trap. It's a signal to the manipulator that their tactics are working, that they still have the ability to shake you, and that is their only currency: emotional control. Now consider this. Have you ever left a conversation feeling like you had to prove you're not the villain? That you had to clarify your motives over and over just to be heard? That is the hallmark of emotional manipulation, where the goal is not clarity, but confusion. Where the more you speak, the more twisted your words become. This is how you become trapped in their frame. You start managing their emotions instead of protecting your own. To make this more concrete, look at the life of Eleanor Roosevelt. She once said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And she lived this. Throughout her public life, she faced relentless criticism, not just from political opponents, but from her own social circles. Rather than argue or defend herself at every turn, she developed what the Stoics would call equanimity. She focused on her work, stayed grounded in her values, and refused to explain herself to those who sought to minimize her. Her silence was not passive, it was principled. But let's go deeper. Why do we feel the urge to explain ourselves to toxic people in the first place? Because we're still hoping they'll validate us. We're still operating under the illusion that they care about understanding us. Stoicism burns that illusion to the ground. It teaches you to value your own perception above the opinions of others. Epictetus said it plainly. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. You do not need their permission to be at peace with yourself. In fact, every time you offer an explanation to someone who's trying to provoke you, you reinforce their sense of control. You teach them that they can unbalance you with just a word or a look, that they can summon your energy, your attention, and your emotions on demand. And soon you're not just explaining yourself, you're defending your very sanity. This is what the Stoics warned us about. When you engage with irrationality, you don't correct it, you enter it, you become part of the storm. And once you're inside that emotional chaos, reason loses its voice. The better response, the Stoic response, is quiet withdrawal. It's not stonewalling, it's clarity. You are not obligated to debate someone who thrives on misunderstanding. You are not responsible for convincing someone who refuses to listen. Your only responsibility is to protect your energy and maintain your inner order. This might sound harsh. It might sound like giving up. But in truth, it's a powerful form of emotional maturity. Because when you stop yelling and stop explaining, something remarkable happens. Your inner world becomes yours again. You are no longer reacting. You are observing. You are no longer chasing understanding. You are practicing it within. A modern example of this can be seen in the way Barack Obama handled public criticism during his presidency. He was often subject to misinformation, misrepresentation, and personal attacks. Yet rather than respond emotionally or defensively, he chose his moments carefully. He knew that not every attack deserved a reply. Not every insult required a rebuttal. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's what the Stoics would call owning your perception. In your own life, you can do the same. The next time someone tries to bait you into explaining yourself, pause. Ask yourself, is this about truth or is this about control? If it's the latter, say less or say nothing at all. You don't need to prove your integrity to someone who only wants to discredit it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, you always own the option of having no opinion. And in that silence lies your strength. When you refuse to argue with chaos, you rob it of its momentum. When you stop explaining yourself to people who manipulate, twist, and mock your words, you reclaim your clarity. So don't yell. Don't explain. Don't chase understanding from people who are allergic to truth. Let your silence speak for you. Let it say, I know who I am, I know what I stand for, and I don't need your validation to stay at peace. Because the moment you stop defending yourself, you start protecting yourself, and that's when the healing begins.
Number 2.
Understanding psychological inflation. There's a particular kind of person who doesn't want resolution. They want escalation, they want your reaction. Not because it leads to clarity, but because it validates their control. Every sigh, every raised voice, every visible frustration you show becomes fuel. And the more fuel you give them, the more inflated their sense of power becomes. This is psychological inflation, the process by which toxic individuals expand their ego at your expense. And unless you understand how this works, you will keep handing them that power, one emotional outburst at a time. The Stoics would call this a failure to guard the gates of your mind. Epictetus, in his discourses, warned, when you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger. This is not a call to self-blame. It's a call to self-responsibility. Because once you understand that manipulators feed on your reaction, you also realize this. Your silence isn't passivity, it's protection. Let's look at how this plays out. Imagine a conversation where you confront someone who has clearly crossed a line. Instead of taking accountability, they smirk, they twist your words, they turn the focus back on your tone, your timing, your delivery, anything but the actual issue. And before you know it, you're defending your emotions instead of addressing their actions. That shift, that's psychological inflation in real time. They are no longer in the spotlight. You are. They're no longer the problem. You're now being painted as unstable or too sensitive. And they thrive in that reversal because now they're not just avoiding accountability, they're gaining elevation by watching you unravel. So how do you stop it? How do you deflate the manipulator's growing ego without feeding the dynamic? The Stoic answer is simple but not easy. Detachment. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've stopped making their behavior about you. You no longer grant them the privilege of deciding your mood. You don't enter the emotional maze they've designed to keep you running in circles. You observe, you disengage, you protect your stillness. One of the clearest modern examples of this was Steve Jobs. Known for his intense personality, Jobs often encountered critics, competitors, and even employees who tried to provoke him, challenge him, or manipulate outcomes. But his genius wasn't just in innovation. It was in his emotional focus. He had an uncanny ability to ignore distractions and stay centered on what mattered. He didn't argue to win people over. He pursued clarity, and when faced with people who were driven by ego, he let their noise collapse into itself. He refused to inflate them with his reaction. That's Stoicism in motion. And here's where the philosophy deepens. Stoicism isn't about denying your emotions, it's about disciplining them. The moment you see your reaction as a resource, as energy to be budgeted wisely, you begin to live with power. You begin to see that not everyone deserves a response, that your silence is not absence, it's presence under control. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events, realize this, and you will find strength." Every manipulator you encounter will try to make you forget that. They will bait you with drama, pull you into chaos, and make you believe that your emotional upheaval is proof that you're alive. But that's not life, it's dependency, and the Stoic rejects dependency on anything external, especially validation from those who create pain just to stay relevant in your life. So what's the move? You stop playing, you stop arguing, you stop giving your sacred energy to people who have shown they will use it against you. Instead, you turn inward, you observe without attachment, and this shift, this psychological sovereignty, is what breaks the pattern. To illustrate, think of Oprah Winfrey. She built an empire while being underestimated, criticized, and scrutinized at every step. She did not fight every battle. She did not respond to every insult. She chose her moments, protected her focus, and refused to let others dictate her emotional state. She once said, "You are responsible for your life. If you're sitting around waiting on somebody to save you, to fix you, to even help you, you are wasting your time." This is the voice of someone who refused to inflate others with her energy. She kept her power, and she rose. And this is exactly what Stoic detachment creates. Elevation, not because you're better than others, but because you refuse to descend into chaos with them. You choose a higher path, not out of pride, but out of peace. Now let's be clear. Choosing detachment will not always be met with applause. Some will accuse you of being cold, of not caring, of being too distant. But you must ask, are these accusations coming from people who respect your boundaries, or from those who benefited from your lack of them? The Stoics understood that being misunderstood is often the cost of being at peace. Seneca wrote, "Let us train our minds to desire what the situation demands, and sometimes the situation demands distance. Sometimes it demands that you say nothing. Walk away and let them feel the weight of your silence instead of the fire of your rage." Because here's the hidden truth. Toxic people do not fear confrontation, they feed off it. What they fear, what truly disorients them, is being met with stillness, with presence, with a calm so unmoved that it forces them to sit with themselves. When they can't get a reaction, they are left alone with their own emptiness. And that is the one space they will do anything to avoid. So don't let your energy be a donation. Let it be an investment. Choose carefully where it goes. And when you sense someone is trying to inflate themselves at your expense, stop responding, stop defending, withdraw with grace. Because psychological inflation ends the moment you stop reacting. The moment you become still, they lose the mirror they used to project power, and in that space you return to yourself. You return to clarity, to freedom, to strength.
Number 3.
Achieving psychological sovereignty. There comes a moment when you realize this isn't about them anymore. Not their words, not their behavior, not even their intentions. It's about you, your boundaries, your inner world, your ability to stand in a storm and not let the rain inside your mind. This is what the Stoics called true strength. Not in domination, not in persuasion, but in sovereignty. The ability to rule yourself fully and consistently, no matter what chaos knocks at your door. Psychological sovereignty is not a trend or a self-help buzzword. It is the core of Stoic freedom. Marcus Aurelius didn't write Meditations for applause. He wrote it to keep himself sane. Every entry was a reminder that though he could not control the senators, the critics, or even his own failing body, he could control one thing: the quality of his thoughts. That and only that was his kingdom. The truth is, most of us give away this kingdom too easily. With one insult, one text message, one backhanded comment, we hand over the keys, we let someone else dictate how we feel, what we think, and what we say. We respond impulsively, explain needlessly, react emotionally, and slowly we lose the throne of our own mind. Until we're no longer living, we're just responding. To reclaim that throne, you must learn the art of deliberate silence. Now, silence in this context is not repression. It is not the silence of fear or avoidance. It is the silence of strength. It is the ability to pause, breathe, and say to yourself, I will not let this in. Because not every opinion deserves residence. Not every provocation deserves a seat at your table. As Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Silence is the choice to react with control instead of chaos. Let's ground this in reality. Think of Fred Rogers, yes, Mr. Rogers, the gentle, soft-spoken man who became a cultural icon by doing something that seems simple but is incredibly rare. He remained calm in a world addicted to noise. Rogers once testified before the U.S. Senate to save public broadcasting. Instead of arguing or shouting, he spoke slowly, with presence, with stillness, and his words, spoken with conviction and without aggression, melted the heart of a hardened senator. That is the power of sovereign silence. It doesn't need to overpower. It simply holds the ground. The Stoics knew that silence was not emptiness, but discipline. When someone insults you and you say nothing, it is not because you're weak. It's because you understand that to defend yourself would give weight to a lie. When someone pushes you for a reaction and you give none, it's not because you're frozen. It's because you're free from their expectations, free from their manipulation, free from the illusion that your peace depends on their understanding. But make no mistake, this kind of silence isn't automatic. It requires practice. It requires awareness. It requires you to become the observer of your own mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The moment you remember this truth, you begin to rule again. Not others, not circumstances, but yourself. And that self-rule is the beginning of true freedom. In modern life, we often confuse loudness with authority. We think speaking up immediately is a sign of courage. But courage, the Stoics would argue, is not in reacting fast. It's in responding wisely. And sometimes the wisest response is none at all. Take the example of Keanu Reeves. He's known not just for his roles, but for his quiet strength. In interviews, he pauses, he listens, he doesn't rush to fill silence. When tabloids attack him or when people try to bait him into controversy, he doesn't lash out. He stays grounded, focused, at peace. He understands that not everything deserves energy, and in that restraint, he commands more respect than if he had shouted back. This is what psychological sovereignty looks like in action. You are no longer triggered by noise. You are guided by inner alignment. You are not seeking to win arguments. You are protecting your peace. Of course, the world will test you. People will call your silence avoidance. They will accuse you of arrogance or indifference. But again, remember, their interpretation is not your responsibility. The Stoic does not live to satisfy public perception. The Stoic lives to satisfy reason, virtue, and peace. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free." And bravery, in this context, is the courage to walk away from chaos without a word, to decline invitations to arguments that go nowhere, to choose clarity over vindication. Because at its core, psychological sovereignty is a form of refusal. You refuse to be a puppet pulled by the strings of emotional bait. You refuse to be a product of someone else's manipulation. You refuse to be emotionally outsourced to people who do not have your well-being in mind. And that refusal, it is the beginning of your rise. You'll notice this shift not in big dramatic changes, but in small moments. Someone sends you a passive-aggressive message, and you say nothing. Someone tries to guilt you into explaining yourself, and you walk away. Someone raises their voice, and you lower yours or stay silent entirely. And in that silence, you feel something you hadn't felt in a long time. Ownership. Ownership of your time, ownership of your emotions, ownership of your presence. From this place, all things begin to change. You begin to choose your words more carefully. You begin to see manipulation before it enters your space. You begin to value your peace so deeply that you protect it, not with swords, but with stillness. And eventually those who tried to provoke you will fall silent too. Because there's nothing more unsettling to a toxic person than a target who no longer flinches, no longer explains, no longer plays. You become unreachable, not because you've built walls, but because you've built standards. So the next time someone tries to pull you into their chaos, pause, remember who you are, remember the kingdom you're building inside, and let your silence be the guard that protects its gates. Because silence, when chosen with clarity, is not absence, it is sovereignty.
Number 4.
Stop replying and let them sit in silence. There's a moment, quiet but powerful, when you realize that saying nothing speaks louder than any reply ever could. It's the moment you stop defending yourself, stop justifying your silence, stop responding to every poke designed to provoke. This moment is not weakness. It is a declaration, a boundary, a refusal to keep watering dead soil. In Stoic terms, it is the withdrawal of energy from what does not serve your peace. And once you stop replying, once you choose not to explain why you've gone silent, something remarkable happens. The toxic person is left with the only thing they can't manipulate: your absence. This is the endgame of psychological sovereignty. Not just the control of your mind, but the deliberate disengagement from people who drain it. Seneca reminds us, associate with people who are likely to improve you. And what if they don't? Then, as he suggests, withdraw into yourself. Silence in that sense is not avoidance. It is return. The reason silence is so disruptive is because it breaks the script. Manipulators depend on a loop. Accuse, provoke, bait, argue, reconcile, repeat. It is a cycle powered entirely by your engagement. But when you step outside the loop, when you simply stop replying, they are forced to confront the one thing they fear most, themselves. And that confrontation, unlike your words, cannot be twisted. Let's take a clear example. Dave Chappelle, after walking away from a $50 million deal with Comedy Central, he was labeled as crazy, unstable, irresponsible. But instead of explaining himself in the press, instead of defending his name to people who didn't understand his values, he went silent. He disappeared from the spotlight, not as a retreat, but as a reset. Years later, when he returned, he did so with clarity, control, and undeniable power. His silence made a louder statement than any interview could have. It disrupted the narrative and forced people to reflect instead of react. That's what silence does. It holds up a mirror, and not everyone is ready to look. The Stoics knew that people crave reaction because it validates their significance. When you reply, even in anger, you affirm their importance. But when you go silent, when you let the phone ring unanswered, the message unopened, the bait untouched, you deny them access. You communicate something far stronger than anger. Indifference, and indifference, when it comes from inner clarity, is untouchable. Now, this does not mean you become cold or cruel. Stoic silence is not emotional shutdown. It's emotional order. It means you no longer participate in dynamics where you are expected to bleed just to be seen. You no longer respond to questions that are traps. You no longer explain your boundaries to people who never respected them in the first place. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." And sometimes being one means saying nothing, not because you're afraid, not because you're passive, but because you understand that your silence is not absence. It's presence with purpose. But what happens when they accuse you of being distant? When they demand an explanation for your silence? When they try to guilt you into speaking? That's when your silence becomes your shield. You see, people who manipulate expect you to play the role they've assigned you. Maybe it's the apologizer. Maybe it's the over-explainer. Maybe it's the one who always comes back. But when you go quiet, truly quiet, they are forced to face the vacuum of your refusal. And that vacuum is uncomfortable because it doesn't allow them to escape into drama. It forces them to reflect or to spiral. But either way, it no longer involves you. Consider the artist Sade. For decades, she's been known not only for her music, but for her profound privacy. She doesn't respond to tabloids. She doesn't chase relevance. She lets the work speak, and the silence between albums? It's not a void, it's reverence. She has mastered the art of letting absence build value, and in doing so, she remains untouched by trends, by drama, by noise. You can do the same. You can choose to let others talk to your silence. You can choose not to give them the closure they pretend to need, but only use to reopen the wound. You can stop explaining, stop justifying, stop making your inner peace a debate topic. Because when someone truly respects you, they won't need constant replies to validate your connection. And when they don't, your silence tells them everything. But here's the challenge. It takes strength to sit in silence. It takes discipline not to react. It takes a deep belief in your worth to let someone misjudge you and still not respond. That's why most people keep replying, not out of clarity, but out of insecurity. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being seen as cold. They fear that silence means they've lost. But the Stoic reframes this. Silence isn't defeat. It's dominion, Epictetus reminds us. If you want to be free, don't wish for things to happen as you want, but wish for them to happen as they do. And when someone shows you who they are through manipulation, let your silence be the final acknowledgement. Let their behavior remain unanswered. Let their tactics go unrewarded. And most importantly, let them feel what it's like to talk to a locked door. If they truly wanted clarity, they would have listened before. If they truly wanted connection, they wouldn't have pushed you away. And if they truly respected you, they wouldn't now be demanding what they once dismissed. That's why your silence is not a punishment. It's a reflection, a mirror of their own choices. In time, you will see the power of this. You will feel your energy returning, your thoughts becoming clearer, your days no longer revolving around someone else's chaos, and what was once noise becomes space, space to think, space to feel, space to grow. So stop replying. Let the silence speak. Let it say everything they refused to hear when you were still explaining. Let it say, you no longer have access to me, because that's not rejection, that's liberation. And it begins the moment you stop replying. You don't need to yell, you don't need to argue, and you don't need to explain yourself to those who thrive on your confusion. What you need, what you've always needed, is space, silence, clarity, the kind of inner strength that doesn't flinch when misunderstood, doesn't chase closure, and doesn't hand over peace just to feel heard. Let toxic people talk to your absence. Let them explain themselves to the silence they created. Because when you stop responding, they lose control. And when you stop seeking validation, you find power. That is the Stoic path, not one of coldness, but one of calm, not detachment from emotion, but from manipulation. So if you felt this message, don't just hear it, live it. And if this gave you the clarity you needed, subscribe and come back. Because here we don't react. We rise quietly, powerfully, always.